Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for being so flexible about tonight's class. It's actually turned into quite a busy day because I had to put this together and also take care of some medical stuff. So here we are. Hopefully this all gets up on time and you have an opportunity to have a look at it. So this week we're kind of looking retrospectively at what we've been doing in this course. And we're beginning to think about what this might look like if we were to think critically about the various readings that we've encountered and the ideas that we've been thinking about and wrestling with and presenting and talking to one another on the forum about and so on. And so some of the kind of key areas for concentrating our criticality around school improvement and notions of leadership and how they're interrelated seem to be captured in certain ways in the two readings that you'll be looking at today. And we'll pick up on this again when we look at the Hargraves and Fink article on Wednesday, which is a pretty breezy article, so we should have no problem getting through both of them or all of them with a review of what we've talked about today, as well as that article. So, and I'll talk a little bit more about that at the end if I remember. At any rate, okay, so let's look at what is a leader to do when you consider all that we've been thinking about and think about how you make sense of all of this, because given the huge responsibilities that leadership holds, it's very tempting to want to go to, aha, that article says exactly what I think should be done, and therefore I think I'll just institute that at my school or in my school system or in my place of work, etc. But a leader is differentiated from those who would simply follow, in the sense, and that's of course a complicated concept too, but we'll leave that aside for a moment, that a leader is someone who is able to step back, think critically about what it is that they're taking in, think about it in the context of where they are providing leadership, and then move forward in a way that makes sense for where they are. And so these articles in some ways help us think through some of the key concepts that we've been talking about. So the Leonard and Leonard article, Reassessing Aspects of Professional Collaboration in Schools, Beliefs versus Practices, takes up some of the ideas that Fullan has put forward and certainly the ideas that Lambert put forward. Leonard and Leonard actually are colleagues or friends of mine. We all went to Oise at the same time. They're originally from Newfoundland. They went to Saskatchewan. They're a husband and wife team, went to Saskatchewan to teach and were very well received there. And then decided that they wanted warmer places. I guess maybe their Newfoundland background kind of precipitated that decision. And they decided to move to Louisiana. So they spent several years in Louisiana at Ruston University, where Laurie Leonard was the dean, and Pauline Leonard was very involved in various leadership and teaching aspects of the teacher education program and the leadership development programs. So they've been very prolific scholars and authors and are well thought of in their field. And are just great people. They really are. They've now retired and are living in Arizona, so they've gone to somewhere even warmer in a certain way, but drier. And Alma Harris and Jones, I'm not familiar with Jones, but Alma Harris is a scholar from the Institute of Education in London, in the UK, and Jones, I can't remember where Jones is, somewhere in the UK, and they've collaborated on a special edition of the Asia Pacific Journal of Education, and because of work that they've been doing with other scholars across the world, looking at systems of education and school improvement efforts, and particularly around issues of leadership development. So we're going to look at those articles and see what they have to tell us. So Leonard and Leonard's paper looks at or spends specific time thinking about what are the shared understandings of collaborative initiatives to improve student learning and school effectiveness. And when we say shared understandings, we mean between teachers and other teachers and leaders in school communities. And what are the disparities in those understandings? Are they, that is, the teachers committed to school improvement initiatives, or are they merely compliant? The principal says this is what we're going to do, the teachers do it. Is that collaboration, or is that simply compliance? Or as Andy Hargraves calls it, contrived collegiality. So they look at this question through the perspective of teachers, because most often we hear about what should leaders do and how can leaders develop leadership capacity, etc., etc. But the leaders are only as good in many ways as those that they work with, the teachers. Pardon me. And so this perspective, I think, is a very, very important one. And when they do this, they find out some pretty interesting stuff. The context of their study is Saskatchewan, which is where they were when they did this study. And as many of you will know, Saskatchewan is that straight-sided province, plunk in the middle of the prairies. It's a very interesting province in many ways educationally, because while most of the provinces in Canada were deep into accountability measures, etc., Saskatchewan for many, many years resisted that impulse and instead maintained a very progressivist notion of education. It's a very rural province, so it's very close-knit around small communities and large fields of wheat and cattle farming, etc. A friend of mine, Don Moline, who is a scholar now at the University of Saskatchewan, but was in Manitoba for many years, her love of Saskatchewan, she and I have done lots of research together, and her love of Saskatchewan has kind of infected me. I've only spent a very small amount of time there, but it just it strikes me as a province in which those kind of small town values very much inform how people interact with one another. So in some ways that's going to affect the findings, and that goes to the Harris article, the importance of context. So what were the findings? Well, first of all, teachers perceive less collaboration occurring in their schools than they consider desirable. So teachers are for collaboration, and they believe that collaboration is something that is going to do good things for the students in their classrooms. Teachers espouse the desire for expanded roles and professional relationships in decision-making and collaborative practice. But they felt that school circumstances were limiting such development. So we'll look a little bit at what some of those limiting factors were. And with the possible exception of sensitivity to student needs and interests, which was very high in their findings, the teachers felt that inadequate worth was given to school diversity in terms of values, beliefs, conflict resolution processes, and consensus building. I should have said earlier that this is a survey study, and the results were assessed using quantitative research methods. And so these findings come out of those survey questions, and they explain in the paper how they came up with the survey instrument and so on. And the last finding was that although teachers felt that professional collaboration was an appropriate use of their time, pardon the spelling error there, they were unable to participate in such processes to the degree that was desirable and necessary. So there's kind of a push and pull developing in these findings between what teachers say they desire and what they are finding in their schools, and how perhaps some tensions are building up around being able to realize their desire and the leadership's desire to create these collaborative communities of learning that were considered important in providing good learning opportunities. So their conclusions kind of take on an if-then kind of model. So they propose that if teachers profess support that professional practice should be highly collaborative, if that's how teachers really feel, then there should be robust expectations that they engage in collaborative activities and not simply engage in what, as I said, Andy Hargraves calls contrived collegiality. That is, using the language of collegiality and, yes, our school is a learning community, et cetera, but really in practice, not expecting that teachers are going to become engaged in those activities and are not, pardon me, are not actually enacting the practices that are necessary. So there be, principals and leaders in the systems should be expecting this. If teachers perceive that their school would be enhanced by greater affinity between colleagues, which the findings suggest that they do, then schools need to be characterized less by competition and individualism and more trust and care. And not to simply assume that trust exists. That, because we're a school and because teachers are nice people, that people trust each other. That does not necessarily follow. And so if we're going to have schools that are in fact trusting places, then we need to attend to that and create the conditions for that. Teachers believe, and if teachers believe that divergent opinions were indicative of a healthy organization, and the wishes of the majority should not be imposed on an individual, which in some ways is kind of an interesting finding, because often we think of collaborative places as places where people agree with one another and everybody gets along. But of course, no human organization exists that way, or a leader's job would be so easy. But rather, in a place where people care about what they do, there are going to be divergent opinions about what needs to be done. And that needs to be seen as healthy, because it creates the conditions for good conversations about various approaches to the kinds of things that need to be implemented so that students can learn well, and so on. But if that's their belief, then as a leader, then I need to be thinking about what kind of democratic processes, and I need to be thinking about this in terms of my collaboratively with the people in my school system. We need then together to be thinking about democratic processes that are needed to be in place that enabled negotiating conflicting and divergent beliefs and values. Sorry about the spelling error there too. And lastly, if teachers believe that spending time on collaborative activities is important, then sufficient time should be allotted for such activities. Now, that's sometimes easier said than done. Anyone who's been involved in school knows what a complex and humming organization it is. There's always things coming and going and changing, and bells ringing and classes moving and all of the sorts of things that go on in schools. And because of that, it's very, very difficult to get a group of teachers together unless it's before school or after school or perhaps during a shared lunchtime or whatever. And so providing a schedule that enables that kind of time, or providing the money that opens up a schedule that enables that time, can be very, very difficult. But nevertheless, it's an enabling condition that needs to be considered very, very carefully. So attention is needed then, first of all, as researchers, they suggest, for more research about teachers, about what are teachers thinking about in schools where these kinds of school improvement initiatives are being implemented. That attention should be placed on working on building trust, because it's the key to building a collaborative culture. And lastly, teachers need to build proficiency in consensus building, decision making, and the processes of conflict resolution. So there are particular skills that are needed in order for people to work together effectively. And we need to develop the kinds of skill building activities and workshops and various things so that people have those skills when they move into those positions, or when they move into those kinds of meeting places and planning places and learning places with one another in schools. So some essential understandings that come out of this study then are that there need to be clear expectations for teacher activity to be collaborative. And as a leader, that's part of your responsibility to ensure that that's a clear message, not an imposed message in the sense of thou shalt and, wagging finger at underneath teachers' nose, but rather that you build a culture of expectation so that teachers are invited into something that's worthwhile and exciting and challenging and is going to provide them with an excellent professional experience. And you need another essential understanding is the cultivation of trusting collegial relationships. And again, the spelling mistake, boy, I shouldn't do these when I'm not feeling well. I apologize. I'll have to fix this before I post it. But the cultivating of these collegial relationships is extremely important. And again, that comes out of some of the readings that we were doing with Noddings, etc., who talk about building caring as a kind of cultural value, as well as a curricular value into schools. And the development of proficiency in the processes of group work. So these are really good places to start. And then from there, you can move into kind of the larger picture elements that Fullan and others propose. And then the Harrison-Jones article, I won't take a lot of time for this, but the Harrison-Jones article is an interesting one. It's really the introduction to a special journal edition, as you probably have gathered by now. So in some ways, it doesn't provide a lot in terms of content. What it does is introduce a journal that will be of interest probably to many of you because it opens up the discussion to the international context. And particularly comparative educational researchers have, of course, by the nature of their work, look across systems internationally. And this has become I apologize. This has become extremely important these days as policymakers consider education as the primary vehicle to effective economic growth. So as we've entered into this globalized age where economies are so interrelated and interconnected and interdependent, it becomes exceedingly important in international politics that that countries are developing in a way that will contribute to that economic growth. And so the vehicle that they're looking at is education. But these authors argue that unfortunately they're looking at education as a place for imposing kind of standardized practices rather than looking at the contextual issues. So these policies have come out of these worldwide large-scale assessments that measure the success of educational efforts across the world. And so, you look at, for example, Finland for a long time had very, very high results in many different areas of education. And so people began to pay close attention to what's going on in Finland that might work here in Canada or might work in the United States or the UK. And Pasi Salzburg, for example, has become a staple on the conference circuit. He's a high-level educator in Finland, and and he speaks often, I know, in Alberta for sure, and he's been in BC a lot, talking about what do they do in Finland. But when you think about the differences between Finland culturally, geographically, etc., does it make a whole lot of sense to impose, kind of verbatim what happens in Finland in Canada or the UK or Australia or the US or Singapore or wherever? Well, there's critics who would argue that no, it doesn't make sense. And there are proponents who say, well, yes, because it works, and so therefore it might work here too. They're not suggesting, Harrison-Jones are not suggesting that, and most of these critics are not suggesting that we abandon LSAs, that is large-scale assessments. But that but we consider them in context and think about them contextually. So the authors of this journal, special edition, consider and compare leadership development in several different countries. And so if you were to read through the journal, and some of you might find it very interesting to have a look through, it's available online through the University of Victoria Library. And in this special edition, they look particularly at leadership development because many argue that leadership development is one of the keys to developing educational capacity. So they argue that when considered comparatively, the limitations of a standardized approach become visible, and that context matters significantly in shaping, defining, and explaining differential performance, and that we cannot simply impose one system on another without there being some implications that need to be considered. So they talk about this whole phenomenon of policy borrowing. A colleague and friend at OISE, now retired, but who's done some really important work, she called this traveling policies. And these traveling policies actually travel with traveling gurus who go from, who are well-known educational professors or whatever, like Michael Fullan and others, who travel from country to country and bring their message with them, and the countries listen to them, and then they implement the changes based on what they say, and then they develop policies around that. So, and this comes out of, this whole move towards large-scale assessments and, bringing in somebody who seems to know what they're talking about in a country where their systems are doing well. And so, and because there's data that seems to suggest that one country is doing better than another, et cetera, then, then we develop this whole culture around school improvement and those who know, and then there, and then the policies that follow those who know. So data analysis to policy prescription becomes the norm. So you do your data analysis. You say, uh-oh, we have to do this, we have to do that. Bring in the consultants, bring in the specialists, and then you develop policy prescription. And those consultants and specialists often are from other countries where, as I said, they're successful, and then you develop some policy prescription. But that is a questionable endeavor in many ways, because the desire to follow the practices of high-performing systems leads to increasingly globalized and standardized educational policy. And, as I've already said, it's often promulgated by high-priced policy consultants who move from country to country. So you have this whole cultural, weather pattern that kind of moves from country to country and leaves behind the, the remains of that weather pattern in that country. But when it rains differently in the desert than it does in the mountains, than it does in the plains, and so on. So it has different effects. Reforms are shipped, the quote says, and I'm sorry I didn't put the page there, I'll fix that when I post this. Reforms are shipped from one side of the globe to another with little real consideration of whether and in what ways they are culturally distinctive or embedded. So what's the connection between leadership and organizational performance? Well, that was the question that they wanted to explore. Pardon me just a sec. And so they've set up this huge study, a 7-system leadership study that explores the process, practice, and impact of leadership preparation and training in 7 different international organizations. So they have international scholars right across the world who are developing their studies using different methodologies and what seems appropriate for the questions in the context in which they're studying. And then they're gradually developing this core of knowledge. So this is an interim report in this special edition because it's reporting on the status of the study and their current findings in these 7 countries: Hong Kong, Indonesia, Russia, Malaysia, Singapore, Australia, and England. And the study that's being reported in the journal compares England to China. So that is a comparative study. And their findings suggest, just as we might expect, that context does matter. And I'll just leave you with 3 quotes from the article. Context remains an important explanatory variable in explaining educational phenomena. The papers illustrate the unintended consequences of education reform can be far more pervasive than any original policy purpose or objective. That what happens in a country when you impose a policy that comes out of another context can have unintended consequences. Those reforms then can be far more pervasive than any other, than the original policy purpose or objective. And sometimes, mostly that's negative. I guess there could be some positive implications, but mostly they tend to be negative. I have a student in my other class that I'm teaching who's from Tanzania. He's a teacher and leader in a institute training teachers to work in schools across the country. And he did an assignment where a visual assignment where he looked at, it's a gender course, so he looked at girls and boys, and so this notion of opening up schools for all students, in a country where the family may bring in $1 a day, and where the children, particularly the boys, have to work for money, has real, when you impose a policy like that, that has real implications. So there's worries about the boys, and in that sense it's good, because it points out that the boys are not getting the kind of education that they need. On the other hand, because the boys are so much more actively engaged in the community, they're seen as the future leaders, because the girls are engaged at school and they're engaged at home, and so their work is not as obvious. So while the girls are being prepared educationally, the boys are being prepared in the real world, and we'll put quotations around that. And because of that, what we're developing in some senses is an uneducated leadership for the country. And so, so the imbalances that become entrenched and magnified by these kinds of policies are kind of astounding, and I found that so interesting looking at that. So just that would be just well, not a small example, I suppose, particularly for the people of Tanzania, but something to think about. And the last is, without policy becoming relevant to the underlying context, any policy undertakings will be unlikely to succeed, or, and this is an important word that we've been talking a lot about in this course, to be sustained. So, context does matter. So when you're thinking about when you're considering what does this mean for motion leaders, well, you can take from this that you need to know your teachers and leaders, that you need to know your context, that you need to know what's happening within that context, and how are people really perceiving the kinds of school improvements that are being worked on and proposed, and where are the rubs in the system, and where are people dissatisfied, and where are people wanting to make change but are not being provided with the conditions for change to occur. And the last is to resist formulas or the policy of the month approach to school improvement, but rather in really attending to these first two, you're more likely to have the kind of sustainable change that you have set out to achieve. So I'll leave you with that. Almost 30 minutes. I apologize for that. Hopefully this is helpful, and I'll set up a forum for you to be able to add your thoughts about this article and these articles rather, as part of your forum activities for this week. So thank you very much. And again, thank you for your flexibility. I'm really hoping that everything comes back okay, and that I'm able to be in class on Wednesday and feeling much more fit and fiddle than I am right now. So I hope everyone's having a good day, and you're feeling well, and we'll get together on Wednesday. Take care.